Good evening, everybody. On behalf of King's College and the India Institute, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the second M.N. Srinivas Memorial Lecture here today. It is a great honor for us that today it is being given by Veena Das, who is one of the most distinguished anthropologists and scholars of India, and whose work has had enormous influence on how we conceptualize and think about contemporary Indian society. Professor Das has been described as one of the most philosophically inclined anthropologists of our times. For Professor Das, this relationship between anthropology and philosophy is a crucial one because both are world-making disciplines who have in their own different moments and ways reflected critically on their own world-making capacities. Her engagement with the works of Wittgenstein and latterly with that of Stanley Cavell comes from the significance she places in her work on language, voice, words, and texts. For an author who has written critical events, it is not ironic, but though it's completely understandable, that with exquisite ethnographic sensibility and anthropological insight, Professor Das has shown the fecundity of the everyday for our understanding of not just the routine and the ordinary, but for the capacity of the ordinary to bring about powerful transformations, where, for example, extreme violence can begin to look extremely ordinary. For Veena Das, violence and suffering does simultaneously exhibit this dual character of the habitual and the momentous, and reveal, I quote, the slippery relation between the collective and the individual, between generic narrative and individual implotment of stories. When much of violence and suffering lie hidden from view, Professor Das asks, what and how can we as social anthropologists come to know this world? It is this concern with the ethics of knowing that has informed her work, from the very first book, Structure and Cognition, to Critical Events and Mirrors of Violence, to the latest work, Life in Words, Violence and the Descent into the Ordinary. Veena Das is the Krieger-Eisenhower Professor of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. She has previously taught in the Department of Sociology, Delhi University, where she had also been a student, had been a PhD student of none else than M.N. Srinivas himself. M.N. Srinivas once remarked, and I quote, when an Indian anthropologist is studying a different caste or other group in India, he is studying someone who is both the other and also someone with whom he shares a few cultural forms, beliefs, and values. That is, he is studying a self in the other and not a total other, for both are members of the same civilization, which is extraordinarily complex, layered, and filled with conflicting tendencies. I consider the study of one's own society not only feasible, but essential. Who better then to give the lecture today instituted in M.N. Srinivas's honor than a student of Srinivas himself? The title of today's lecture is Finding an Address, Reflections on an Urban Neighbourhood. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Veena Das.
Good evening, and thank you very much, Kriti, for that very, very wonderful introduction. It's really great to be here and see so many friends, but it's also very nerve-wracking because in some ways to be able to speak about Professor Srinivas is a very, or to speak in a seminar named after him is a very humbling experience, but I do want to really congratulate the director and the faculty of the India Institute for having instituted this lecture on his name. So as a student of M.N. Srinivas, I had learned to pay attention to the minutest of movements within a local setting. But I also inherited from him an interest in varying scales at which social phenomena might be investigated. This lecture weaves together events at different scales of social life that make everyday life a scene of precarious belonging, as well as the forms of action that make it possible for the poor to aspire and shape the democracy we inhabit in India. As is well known, Srinivas had engaged in a vigorous debate with Louis Dumont on arguing that locality could not be reduced to a secondary principle in India. But I believe the importance of the local for him was not so much a question of structural principles as it was a question of how a locality got thickened by the lived experience of everyday exchanges, delicate forms of solidarity, the bursting out of disputes that were both a cause of the fraying of relations, but also provided great amusement to those who gathered to witness the verbal exchange of abuses. Most of all, it was in the remembered village that he was able to portray this aspect of village life, bringing out the texture of relations by describing such quotidian routines as bathing arrangements on the one hand, and quite extraordinary events such as the dispute with the gods over rain. But Srinivas's attunement to the local was always mediated by his interest in what was happening at the national level, as his essays on the importance of caste in elections or his critique of reform strategies evolved from the government offices by bureaucrats whose life was untouched by the events in villages and small towns. I present my lecture today partly as a development that grows from Srinivas's interest in the anthropologist's craft, that is attentive to the minutiae of everyday life, and deciphers the presence of the so-called larger institutions such as the law and state in everyday life. But as he would have expected, I also shift the focus of discussion to a different direction. And I say as he would have expected because he told me once that the only successful teacher was someone whose teachers could actually prove him to be wrong. So that was a very generous way in which he allowed. I remember the first time I wrote a book review was an extremely critical review of his Social Change in Modern India. And he said to me, well, I have no problems in letting you cut your milk teeth on my book. I have really missed him all these years. So in much of my recent work on everyday in low-income neighborhoods in Delhi, I would often come across expressions and practices that suggested some kind of a descent into the ordinary through evoking such expressions as friendship with the earth. To take an example of the kind of setting, a local leader in a low-income settlement in Delhi asked me, "If you fly high, where will you fall?" I replied as I was expected to, "On the earth." He laughed, nodded, and said, "So our friendship should be with the earth, no?" I realized that the kind of concerns to which I've been devoting my attention in the last 10 years or so, such as how do people get water or electricity, how are government service conducted in slums, and so on, seem banal when seen from certain heights of theory. What could ever be of theoretical interest in the trivial details in which the perils of everyday life here are expressed? Yet, as I sit in dark rooms without windows, or in the shadows and smells of heaps of waste collected from the neighborhood hospitals or factories, with discordant sounds pouring in from the street, and listen to stories about what it took to get an official document, or the extent of effort a woman had to make to carry gallons of water perched on the back of a bicycle from a tube well or a water tanker, and carry it up a hilly terrain, I hear the protests of a Beckett character. You're on earth, there's no cure for that. The title of this paper comes from a relatively trivial event. 15 years ago, when I started working with a team of researchers in a number of low-income neighborhoods, I had given a lecture in a local girls' school and was then befriended by a number of children who urged me to visit their homes. My colleagues and I took their addresses with the promise of visiting them later. Yet we found later that we simply could not find the addresses, since numbers inscribed on the doors of walls of the houses did not resemble anything like an address. We discovered that these were numbers put by the gas agency to aid them in the delivery of gas cylinders. As an unauthorized colony, people told us they did not have any official address. Later in 2000, when we moved to study an adjoining area, we found that instead of one address, there were several addresses that were inscribed on the doors. So you could kind of be walking and seeing P18 next to D242 and, Z232 inscribed in the same door as P128 and so on. Okay. The particular story then is partly the story of how these houses came to have multiple addresses. Through tracking these addresses by means of 40 address interviews, attending meetings called by local leaders, and sometimes walking with them in the meandering streets as they explained the significance of particular landmarks, we learned how to investigate the forms of belonging that characterize urban neighborhoods that officially come under the category of unplanned settlements. In the process, I also learned what kind of struggles ensued around such quotidian needs as electricity and water. I tried to describe these issues under the generic heading of making a world inhabitable. I start with a local leader whose observation on our friendship with the earth gave me an opening into this paper. Sanjeev Gupta lives in Punjabi Basti, a neighborhood in West Delhi, which in official parlance, as I said, is known as an unauthorized colony, a type of settlement that is included under the general rubric of unplanned settlements. The latter is a catch-all category that includes official slums, urban villages, shantytown juggi-jhompdi colonies, and old traditional bazaars. Inhabitants of such neighborhoods enjoy some rights as citizens. For instance, they are entitled to vote and to receive subsidized food through the public distribution system, as well as having access to government-run institutions such as schools and hospitals. But they are not officially entitled to sanitary services, water, or electricity connections, since they live in places that are not recognized by the city as authorized residential areas. And these are not exceptions. That is to say, if by several counts, something like 70% of Delhi's population actually lives in what would be called official slums, unofficial slums, unauthorized colonies, and so on. So really, the majority live in these areas. And out of the 7 state constituencies for elections, 5 actually are those in which the majority of the residents belong to these unauthorized colonies. And this obviously has a great effect on the way in which democratic politics would be conducted in the city. So when I say that they're not entitled to these, I don't mean they don't get these. And this is why it's very interesting to see what happens between the question of who has the official entitlements and in what kind of way is the political system negotiated in order to get these public goods. So in order to, so in recent years, scholars have begun to seriously reflect on the kinds of ambiguities and indeterminacies that mark the position of such settlements in relation to law and government regulations. I'm interested here in a limited question that has to do with the kind of world that is disclosed in the story of the residents' engagement with the politics of housing, electricity, and water. I want to start by reiterating that though the law defines the status of the unplanned settlements and the various types of administrative regulations to which they are subject, that is to say, you can get regulations. For example, if you are an officially recognized slum, then you cannot legally be evicted from that area. And there are very interesting legal cases, like corporate groups like the State Bank of India has actually gone to the court saying that it cannot be evicted because it is actually established in one of the branches in a unauthorized colony. So what happens is very interesting in terms of the fact that these kinds of laws are actually constantly being used for very different kinds of purposes. Okay, so I want to start by reiterating that though the law defines the status of the unplanned settlements and the various types of administrative regulations to which they are subject, to create the impression of an orderly legal process, the boundaries between the legal and the illegal are not at all clear. First, there are bitter rivalries between different government departments about land use. Second, the courts do not speak with a single voice on this issue. Though there are different administrative acts that govern these unplanned settlements on such matters as provision of public services, restrictions over eviction, and claims for alternative housing, smuggled into these official documents is the uncomfortable realization that the government is dealing with many of the issues after the fact. The different kinds of urban settlements have grown by within quote illegal occupation of government-owned land, often right under the noses of the authorities, and the acts of enumeration and classification are running to catch up with the kind of growth from the ground up. Sanjeev Gupta explained the process as follows. It is not as if there is an existing map on the basis of which a colony is developed. Rather, a map is forcibly put on spaces that have come into being haphazardly and which continue to grow and change as new opportunities and needs arise. If the poor learn to dwell in these spaces, it is learning what it is to be thrown into a political and legal landscape that cannot be deciphered except through their engagement and action on their environment. Punjabi Basti, located in West Delhi, where Sanjeev Gupta lives, lies over an area covering 34 acres with a built-up area of 21.59 acres. In its immediate vicinity lie unauthorized colonies and official slums, but situated at a little distance is the affluent area of West Patel Nagar with its bustling markets and middle and upper class housing. I should interrupt myself and say that one of the very interesting things about South Asian cities is that in most other places of the world you can actually draw a line between where the affluent live and where the poor live. And a lot of mapping has been done, but it's never been possible to actually delineate, with very few exceptions, areas in which only the rich live and areas in which only the poor live. So, Punjabi Basti has 2003, bear with me, you'll see why I'm kind of giving such pedantic details. Punjab Basti has 2,318 plots, combined houses and shops, though multiple households may live within the same house. So let us take a deceptively simple question. From where do these figures come from? How did a house or a shop acquire something as simple and taken for granted as an address? Note that while figures are available for election constituencies or for census wards, Punjabi Basti did not figure as a separate colony in official records till 1995. Earlier it was assimilated in the larger area of Baljit Nagar. Even now, many documents such as ration cards or voter ID cards record the locality as Punjabi Basti Baljit Nagar. Till a few years back, streets did not have numbers or names. Certain landmarks were used to divide different parts of the neighborhood. Thus, crossroads were named after small temples that had come up through local effort, such as Gayatri Chowk, named after the goddess Gayatri. Certain sites were marked after important events, such as the hosting of the national flag on Independence Day came into being, so Flagstaff crossing. Boundaries between neighborhoods were fluid. The geography of the area thus reflects an order that emerged from an evolving collective life rather than from official planning or control. I will not go into the detailed history of the area except to indicate two features essential for understanding the story that follows. The first is that families of earlier settlers that we could locate all indicated that they had moved from different parts of Delhi soon after 1976, when a national emergency was declared and the infamous forced sterilization and beautification drive in Delhi was implemented. However, Punjabi Basti did not come about as a resettlement colony, a term that designates areas to which the poor were forcibly relocated during the beautification drive. Rather, many of these families voluntarily moved here because they saw in this time the opportunity to claim empty land. And I'd like to say this is actually very interesting, so that each neighborhood, in fact, has a very different history. And these are people who came over there because they could see that a lot of the poor were forcibly being removed to different kinds of areas. And so many of the labor who had come and didn't want to go back thought that this was a great opportunity to actually acquire assets. So simultaneously with forcible movement, you also have these voluntary movements in these particular areas. So the local term for this process is called jagah gherna, which literally means enclosure of a place, and can be used in a neutral way when people are making a reference to the amount of labor that went to enclose a piece of unoccupied land and convert it into a house. Alternatively, the term has the connotation of illegality when one voices the perspective of law, seeing the world through the eyes of the government officials, as was the case of qabza of mosques in Pakistan. People could take both perspectives, claiming simultaneously that it was their labor that had made the area inhabitable, and at the same time conceding that the land had been taken without going through the legal mechanism that bestows ownership within the formal regime of property relations. Second, Punjabi Basti is spread over a hilly terrain, which makes different streets stretch over different levels. Each small segment of this locality can be said to have a slightly different history. Part landfill, part rocky terrain from which large slabs were extracted, part forest. The process of settling the area has required different kinds of labor, such as clearing of the forested part, filling out craters created by extraction of large slabs by builders, and leveling the ground to make the roads more negotiable. I note in parentheses that the kind of labor that had to be put to make this area inhabitable was very different from that required in other places. E.g., when slums developed right in the middle of affluent colonies, as construction laborers who had been given permission for temporary shelters converted these into permanent habitation. So there's a really interesting difference, that is, if you see where are these slums located, there are really interesting local differences, so that the kind of thing that Punjabi Basti is, people will always remember how much labor they had to put to actually make that area inhabitable. Whereas other areas, one of the other areas we are working in was basically an area which came up again around the time of the emergency, when the National Capital Region was developed. Where, because the planners had planned for all the affluent households, but they had never, and very posh buildings, but they had never thought as to what would be the requirement, what would be the needs of labor. And so they had, when I interviewed one of the officials, he basically said, we thought the contractors will bring in the labor and they will take away the labor after the work was completed. But of course that never happens, and so the form of inhabitation becomes very different, and that's very interesting in terms of the way in which people talk about their right over that land versus whether or not they're occupying it legitimately or illegitimately. So in Punjabi Basti, there was a strong sense of the legitimacy that residents claimed for their actions. As one woman said to me, "Sister, everyone lives over occupied land. All these rich owners of bungalows, did they come to earth owning land? Did they have to put in the kind of labor that we did to make this uninhabitable place into a dwelling?" Dharma Devi, B.D. Joshi, Hargovind Ramgarhia are among the first settlers who moved in this area in the early 70s. All three migrated from other areas of Delhi, where they were engaged as unskilled labor in construction work. The initial settlement was about 40 households who had enclosed or encroached upon and demarcated certain areas and then worked this land to make it inhabitable. These early settlers in time sold off parts of the land they had occupied to others. Joshi claims, and Joshi is a local leader, claims and others agree that at one time the whole street on which Joshi lives was an enclosure created by him through an act of jagah gherna, and that he settled that part of Punjabi Basti. Such transactions of land in shanties or houses have a very ambiguous place in law. However, within the local world in which such settlements are made, there are well worked out procedures by which selling, buying and renting of houses takes place. While documents are not registered in the municipal corporation, they are nevertheless recognized through mutual witnessing. That is to say, they will actually get a legal form, an affidavit, and agree to this particular transaction with two witnesses, and that has force within the local community. It's not clear whether it would have force if they went to a court of law, and we shall see, in what kind of way force comes to be acquired within the legal domain. So according to Joshi, it was sometime in the 1980s that a major setback occurred. Ramjas Foundation, a large charitable foundation, claimed it was the legal owner of land that these families had occupied. And they had the right, that is, the foundation had the right to levy a license fee on that land. Ramjas Foundation also began to assign addresses to houses. So this was the first time, because before that, first they never got very many letters, but if they did, the letter typically would have an address of the sort saying, Ramkrishan Dharno, house right behind such and such shop. And the letters would in fact be delivered. But Ramjas Foundation is the first one which tried to systematize, not systematize it, but at least to give it a number. These addresses, and they issued receipts to them, and the license charges was rupees 152 per month for the use of that space. So it was interesting that they said they're not renting out the space to them; they're only giving them the space in as the license place, and that they would have to pay license fee and not rent. And we shall see that this has very interesting legal implications. These addresses were assigned haphazardly. P124 could well be nestling against D28, and sometimes the same address was found in several different houses in different parts of the colony. So you think E3 was over here, and you walk a little further, and there's another E3, and then you walk a little further, and there's still another E3, right? There were no, even at that time, no street names were actually given. Ramjas Foundation, so even on the legal stamps it would say things like I-128 near the Gayatri Temple. Ramjas Foundation enforced its license fee by threats of legal action and by the use of physical force. Many people were resentful that Ramjas Foundation was trying to rob them of their rights over land that they felt was rightly theirs, since it was their labor that had made the area inhabitable. As an act of defiance, some residents, including B.D. Joshi, started using different self-assigned addresses. So that's why the first division happened, why two addresses come into being, because they refused to accept the address which the Ramjas Foundation had assigned to them. They also began to organize themselves by forming a registered society known as Punjabi Basti Sudhar Samiti. This is actually the first NGO that was established in this area. And it's quite remarkable because it was not established through the way later NGOs were established, which was primarily because international funding became available, or some project became available, or the government wanted some NGO to be formed. So it's really quite remarkable that these were actually, that there in these areas these very indigenous local NGOs which come into being. I described the legal battle nest. So I'm going to step away from the local context for the moment and give an account of the legal issues that were involved in Ramjas Foundation's claims of ownership over vast stretches of land within which Punjabi Basti was included. The following summary is from Ramjas Foundation versus Union of India, Civil Appeal number 6662, filed in 2004 and settled in 2010. I'm not going to give a full account of the legal issues, fascinating as these are, and instead try to show the points at which the Punjabi Basti residents' claims over housing came to rub against the claims of Ramjas Foundation's battle with the government of India over ownership of this land. So this is very interesting. It's because there is a battle with the government of India, as we shall see, that these local residents become implicated at all. Otherwise, there was no reason why Ramjas Foundation would have tried to go and put addresses on their shanties. So Rai Sahib Kedarnath, who retired as district judge from the Punjab Judicial Service, started three schools in parts of Delhi between 1912 and 1916 to honor the memory of his father, Lala Ram Jasmal. Kedarnath had bought 1,800 bighas of land from his own resources as well as through donations in what were then the villages of Chokri Mubarikabad and Sadra Kurd, but are now part of National Capital Territory. In a public function held on 25th December 1916, Kedarnath had announced that he had formed a waqf and donated all his movable and immovable properties for charitable purposes, namely to provide aid for the education of the poor. In 1917, he formed the Ramjas College Society and had it duly registered under the Society's Registration Act 1860. Later, he transferred all his property to this society, which was renamed as Ramjas Foundation in 1967. The legal conflict with the Government of India has its genesis in a notification around 1959 under the Land Acquisition Act by the Chief Commissioner of Delhi, which proposed the acquisition of 34,070 acres of land for planned development of Delhi, of which a portion of the land, that is about 870 bighas, belonged to the appellant. However, exemption from acquisition was granted to several categories of property, including waqf property. Ramjas Foundation claimed that since Kedarnath had declared that he was converting his property into a waqf property, this land was exempt from acquisition from the government. Without going into the detailed reasoning provided by the court, I simply point to the final judgment according to which a Hindu could create waqf property, but it could not be used for furthering the cause of any other people except Muslim or Islamic institutions. This is sort of fairly interesting. That is to say, in Punjab, the term waqf was not seen as a religious term. That is, Hindus used the term waqf, Muslims used the term waqf. And so when Lala Kedarnath created this, he created it as a waqf foundation. And in fact, Tarkunde, who was the one who came to the, who was the Ramjas Foundation's lawyer, argued that it would be discriminatory to say that a Hindu could not create waqf. And so the court ended up by saying that the Hindus could create waqf, but they couldn't use it for educating anyone else except Muslims or for some Islamic foundation. You couldn't create a waqf and then use it to educate Hindu children, for example. So I'm not going to go into the legal issues, but it's quite interesting how this particular contingent fact that there is this fight going on actually comes to settle in relationship to these particular residents. While this battle on the larger issues was being waged in the courts, Ramjas Foundation probably hit on another strategy to claim ownership. They filed cases in lower courts against several residents of colonies such as Punjabi Basti for non-recovery of license fee. So I've been given the documents for one such case, but I understand that several residents faced police and legal action. The case I described pertains to the lawsuit of recovery of possession and damages that was filed in the Trisazari court in Delhi by Ramjas Foundation, and the sum total of the course is that this very poor guy living in this particular locality, Ramjas Foundation goes to court saying he owes us 5,000 rupees, right? And the court in the end rightly said, look, it's very clear, your strategy is very clear to us, which is really that you're hoping that the lower court will recognize your right on that particular property, and then the Supreme Court will be bound by the fact that your rights over that property have been recognized, and therefore it actually refused to give, to recognize that the Ramjas Foundation had any rights over this particular land. What is also very interesting is that although this didn't come up that much in court, actually the residents had befriended people in the revenue office, and what they did was they actually went and tried to find all the old documents, which were the documents which record actual plot area and title and so on, and found that in fact the place which they were occupying did not even come under that money that had been, under that land that had been bought from these two villagers. And this, so that there was this very simultaneously, very interesting small events which were taking place in relationship to their particular rights over the way in which they could claim rights to that. So it's interesting. The judgment states the notification of land acquisition was issued on 13/11/1959. And license was granted on 21/06/1986. Thus, the plaintiff was very well assured that the acquisition proceedings in respect of the land of which the suit property forms a part had been initiated. Thus, the plaintiff had no authority to create any license qua the land in question. And this is a huge victory for them because they had been really intimidated by the Ramjas Foundation goons to say that they should actually, not that they should vacate it, but that they should recognize the right of Ramjas Foundation to be levying license fee on them. People living in the area are not entirely clear about legal and constitutional issues involved in the characterization of Waqf property. There is nevertheless a clear understanding that Ramjas Foundation has not fought a legal battle with Jhuggi dwellers for the recovery of Rs 5,000. Rather, the aim was to establish ownership through another route. They see this strategy as a continuation of the intimidation and coercion exercised by the foundation for getting license agreements signed by them. It is worth emphasizing here that this particular conflict was not fought with the help of any activist organization or legal help cells outside the locality. Rather, it was the Punjabi Basti Sudhar Samiti which gathered the necessary expertise from various sources, and that itself would take a whole paper to say how do people actually get this expertise. And it's very fascinating because sometimes you get like, I didn't know who to go to. I just went and sat on the steps of the High Court. And there was some nice lawyer who said, why are you coming here and sitting here every day? And I said, I really want to know how do I go about this. And then I got some help from them, right? So these networks of knowledge which themselves I think are very fascinating as to what is it that enabled action, in fact, on their part. Okay. Okay, so the interesting thing is that that once the Ramjas conflict was resolved, as many of them said, there's another conflict which emerged, which is really that then the particular notification of the Government of India came to be valid, which meant that now the land was owned by the DDA, which is the Delhi Development Authority. And so a next set of questions about whether or not they have the right to occupy that land, comes into being. But because of a very complicated set of reasons, the government has been very restrained. Part of it is the topology of the place. It's simply not possible in that particular place to go and break up the houses. The streets are so narrow and walking in them is so difficult that it's very clear that no cranes can come and actually it would be enormously costly exercise for the government to actually try and break up that locality. It has tried to do it with some adjoining localities, but not with this particular locality. Nevertheless, the fact that this land was now the question that the DDA owned this land became a very, very pressing issue for them, and this is why they started. They evolved this entire idea that it was not Ramjas Foundation, but that they were in some kind of partnership with the government in ways in which they recognized that the land belongs to the government, but that they have a right to actually live over there. So since then, since I've examined the various documents that are created when houses, the little houses that they make are sold, it's very interesting that from that time they begin, the documents will say, in selling this particular house with this, we are selling to you, we are getting from you the cost of our labor and the cost of materials. They don't say that what we are getting, that we have a right to sell the land. And so, very interestingly, their own sense of what is law tends to become interestingly reflected, in fact, in these very, very proliferating local documents. Okay, so then the next set of questions, so there's some way in which the next set of questions is very strongly tied up with the question of how do they move from being an unauthorized colony to what is now a provisionally authorized colony, not yet a fully authorized colony, but they now have the status of a provisionally authorized colony. And that story is very strongly linked with the question of their efforts to try and get electricity. So the next section is called Acting on the World, What Makes Electricity Flow. Walking in Punjabi Basti, one is struck by the presence of 7 large transformers with high tension wires installed on bits of land that are on street corners in the bits of greenery that passes for park, and in one case on the side of a temple. Now this again, if you are attuned to the local, you immediately recognize how unique that is, to have 7 transformers in this locality, Whereas in most other places, what you would see is high tension wires and wires which have been pulled out from this particular high tension wires to actually give electricity through private entrepreneur arrangements with the houses. The story of the electrification of this neighborhood begins with the privatization of electricity in Delhi in the year 2000 and 2002. When power reforms begin in 2002 in Delhi, in light of the heavy loss incurred by the state-owned Delhi Vidyut Board, the latter was unbundled into 3 privately owned companies. Sanjeev Gupta and many others told us about the terrible harassment that residents faced when electricity officials lodged complaints with the police about theft of electricity. As in most such neighborhoods, people had earlier drawn electricity illegally from street poles to draw lines to their homes, shops, or workshops to power domestic or commercial applications. The networks of private contractors and low-level officials of the municipal corporation who were routinely bribed had assured that the residents did not face criminal charges for thefts of electricity. Now with privatization, they were finding that the game plan had completely changed. Sanjeev Gupta used his position as the president of the local zonal Congress committee to arrange a meeting sometime in 2005 between the representatives of the locality and officers in charge from the zonal division of the company, the electricity company, that is the BSES, to discuss the issue of electricity theft and harassment. Here is the description of what transpired. I juxtaposed fragments of the account given by Sanjeev Gupta in Hindi over several informal discussions with an account of the issues involved in electrification as given by one of the officers of the private company. With singular lack of imagination, I call him Vidyut sir, which just means electricity sir. So what happens over here in what the account that I give you is that the fragments come from different moments. It's also the case that Sanjeev was often relating the story in the presence of objects that materialize the story. That is to say, as we would go, he would say, that particular transformer, this is what happened around that. Or that he would say, you see that particular place, that's where we first tried to do such and such. Whereas with Vidyut sir, he's sitting in a posh office and we are actually talking about what happens in this period. So Sanjeev Gupta, after electricity was privatized, there was a big move to install meters. Now, as you know, in colony like these, there are no regular meters. There were local contractors who used to supply electricity for payment by drawing lines from the high tension wires, or else many people drew the lines themselves and there were regular payments extracted by local linesmen and policemen. We said to Vidyut sir, "Sir, we have been demanding regular supply of electricity, but you do not sanction meters for us. On top of it, you file complaints and the police treats us like criminals. They come and catch hold of the person by the neck as if he had committed a major crime, as if he was a murderer. What kind of justice is this?" Vidyut sir replied that their record showed how much electricity had been consumed in this locality and what was the recovery of money against it. He said vehemently, "I say on that basis, I say that I have proof. I say that people are stealing. They are thieves." We said, "Sir ji, how can you call us thieves? If you don't give us electricity on the grounds that we are not an authorized colony and people naturally need electricity, a man wants to run a fan, his little children are burning in the heat, he will get electricity with whatever means. Then why call him a thief?" Vidyut, the officer speaking in English, "My boss and I were both very struck by Sanjeev Gupta's argument. We thought ethically, how could we accuse them of theft when we have not responded to their needs? There was a lot of discussion within the management. From the business angle, there was a market here, but could we manage it? There were huge problems of how to identify houses correctly. The addresses were all haphazard, there were no numbers or names of streets, it was a maze. That is, the idea was that you put up a meter, and the person who has to go and collect the fee would never find the house. Or if he tries to go there and the guy would say, "Oh, this is a bill for E3, but actually this is not E3, the E3 is over there." And he would go over there and there would be another E3 house over there. So really it was, from their perspective, it was something which was completely unmanageable. Sanjeev says, "I was truly struck by the accusation of theft. This utterance," he says, "struck me. We said, Sir Ji, we will remove this stigma that we are a colony of thieves. Vidyut sir guided us, so did another officer. The big issue was that the houses did not have addresses in sequential order. Streets did not have names or numbers. Sometimes if a licensed man was expected to deliver a bill, the client would simply rip up his meter and say, my house is not C4, that house is in another street. Vidyut officer, we advised them that they had to get a proper map of the area with house numbers in order. They had to submit a list of names of households with proper addresses. Without such a list, we could not install regular meters. Sanjeev Gupta and some other leaders, so then they organized a meeting with the residents. They got 200 rupees per household to get a map made. And now this seems like such a simple thing, right? You know, the electricity officers would like a map. But I've examined 60 letters which actually went around in this whole question of how to actually get an authorized map. First, the problem was that they couldn't get architect companies to do it. Then when they did get someone who actually did put in the whole effort, the Ministry of Urban Development said that this was not an authorized map because the town planner who had authorized it had not taken his permission, etc. And those who know the forms of these writings will immediately recognize it. It would be like, dear sir, we are now attaching the authorized map by the city planner and as well as the certificate that the city planner is recognized by the municipal corporation. The answer would be, dear sir, we acknowledge your letter of such and such. However, the permission for this was not taken before the town planner started to do that, etc. So, in a certain sense, bureaucratically, it would have been absolutely impossible to actually get a map. What Sanjeev Datta did, what he did was, in some ways, to actually use his to use his connections with the political system. And this is sort of fairly interesting, that because this is a colony from which Congress has always won. And that particular year there were elections, and they all got together, and they really, I've seen these letters which they wrote to the chief minister saying, please be aware that if we do not get this map sanctioned, then next time that you come over here, you are not going to be greeted by garlands, you are going to be greeted by shoes. Right? Which again at the level of discursive formation seems like very courageous things that they're able to do, but it still didn't solve the problem that they did have to get the bureaucrats to sign that. So you get then other series of letters between the chief minister's office and the and the Delhi Development Authority and the Municipal Commissioner's Office to try and see that an authorized map can actually be prepared. And actually an authorized map was prepared, and we still have letters which go forward and backwards to the kind which say that yes, you have an authorized map, but you have not clearly indicated the boundaries. And their point is that there are no boundaries which can be clearly indicated between what is Punjabi Basti and what is actually the next kind of adjoining company, because the records have always been like this. Now the interesting thing over here is that this is how they actually managed to get a third address, which is that the electricity company doesn't want to rely on the first two addresses because these are haphazard. So then they say, now we must give addresses which are sequential. But all the old documents, including court documents, had these haphazard addresses. And so now if you examine the documents, you get P12, old address, Z280, Ramjas license something. Ramjas has now been removed because the court has ruled that. And then the third address, which might be the electricity address. So it was characteristic of, that was one set of problems. But the other set of problems which came actually were from the local entrepreneurs. So I'm not trying to make the picture of the slum as some kind of the heroic poor individuals, because here, in fact, there was a huge flourishing trade of people who used to supply electricity and get money in order to supply this electricity, and so their business was very threatened by the fact that electricity was going to be completely regularized. So I don't want to give the impression that the map making, the assigning of new numbers, installation of transformers achieved by agreements arrived through rational deliberative discourse. Acquisitions have been made in the locality that all the money that was collected was not properly accounted for. There were fights over exact location. The Dalits complained that transformers had been placed in a park that was to be named after Ambedkar and so on. But the gravest threat to Sanjeev Gupta came not openly but in many covert ways from the network of entrepreneurs who were earlier supplying electricity illegally and whose business was adversely affected. One day when Sanjeev Gupta was relating the efforts that had to be made to complete the project, he suddenly choked, and I saw that his eyes were tearing. He said, "I was even attacked one night when I was coming home." "What happened? How did you get hurt?" "No, but they showed me a revolver and told me to stop these activities." "Who were they?" He says, "Oh, the ones who do this dukanderi, literally market transactions, the idea of illicit transactions, whose illicit work would have stopped." "Did you report to the police?" "No, the local police is always on their side." "So what did you do? How do you know you are safe?" He says, "I told you I was not a die-hard congressman. I'm in the party because I cannot do without it. So those above were informed and they must have talked to them. After all, the ones who were intimidating me were also part of the same setup." It's very clear that it's the same. He's not saying that the Congress Party is the great heroic party. It's the same party from which people are enabled to carry on this illicit trade, to threaten those who do something, and the same party who will give protection precisely because he's a very important person in terms of the capability to get people organized. It was characteristic of Sanjeev Gupta's mode of relating a story that he refused to name those who had intimidated or threatened him. Clearly, he lived and worked in a context in which people led lives steeped in what he thought of as corruption, theft, and extortion. For instance, when describing an ongoing case of demolition of shanties in an adjoining neighborhood in which many people lost their abodes, he predicted that they would be back and will reoccupy the land, but they will have to pay again to the very people who had first encouraged them to occupy the vacant land. It is the same people who had first allowed them to occupy this land by giving an extortion fee to them, and then had the demolition squads out, and will now again extract money from them. He would only name the people as the local bhumafia, land mafia. You think that land mafias all come from outside with the big building lobbies, but there is a local bhumafia too, which operates right from within. Once during the discussion of a house, there was a much that was being renovated close by with expensive materials. I tentatively suggested the name of the prominent local leader as probably benefiting from the activities of building by extorting some kind of protection money. "You have named him, not I," said Sanjeev Gupta, and then went on to add, "You must learn to understand that people are 60% good and 40% bad." The general scene was the relations of proximity required that one saw in everyone some good and some bad. Sanjeev Gupta's shifting mood, his feelings of being powerful and vulnerable at the same time were clear in most stories he told. The moment that he recalled with great pride was that of the inauguration of the transformers, the most significant aspect of which was that no ceremony was performed to mark the occasion. There was much discussion. Should we get a Brahmin to tell us the muhurat for the inauguration? Excuse me. Who should we invite? Should we invite the MLA? Should we invite the MP? And nobody was invited. Then he's relating this imaginary scene. So he's saying, "Oh, how did this happen?" He's conjuring up the people who were not invited. "Oh, how did this happen? Transformers were put, the whole area got electrified, and we were not called to inaugurate." This is typically the politician's voice. "Oh, Sahib, who are you anyway? You are our representatives. We chose you. It is due to us that you sit high above. Otherwise, who are you? You should have asked after us when we suffered. Why should we call you for this occasion? Did you spill blood and sweat as we did?" So you can see a distribution of voices in some ways. But I want to go to another moment, another day, when Sanjeev and I were sitting, and he relates the same story. The occasion was that Delhi was in the middle of this great disaster preparation, and the civil defense had said that they would send a high official to come and give tell people how to save themselves if there was a sudden earthquake. And I'd been roped in, to also give a little speech. And so while we were waiting over there, we were waiting for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and so the civil defense guys hadn't turned up. And when they did turn up, they said, we completely lost our way. I mean, how does one ever find how to get over here? So it became very clear that if there was a sudden earthquake, quite clearly no civil defense people were actually going to turn up over there. But that's the time that he actually recalled that particular story, which is that's very interesting about field work, which is not that you could tell one story at one time, and another time the same story is told with a completely different affect. So the other story was, he says, that day when the transformers began to function, only we knew from which personage to which other we had to run. Who are the people before whom we had to rub our foreheads on the ground? Kis kis ke samne, kis kis ke piche bhage, kis kis ke samne matha ragra. The reference to a gesture that signifies utter abjection may not have literally taken place, but language conveys here the embodied sense of humiliation. Yet Sanjeev Gupta was not defeated. He plans to take up the issue of water, since other leaders in the area seem to have failed at this task. He shows me about 60 letters he has written to the Delhi Water Board and the Municipal Corporation. He has finally succeeded in getting an official of the Water Board to admit that there are no official policies for supply of water, and is hoping to get, now that he has an officially approved map of the area, he is hopeful that he can actually take this letter and go to court again to try and say that the government must come up with a proper policy for supply of water to unauthorized colonies. So I'll give you a brief commentary, which is Sanjeev Gupta is not known in the neighborhood for his rhetorical skills. There are others whose rhetorical skills are just great. I mean, they can bring in mythical motifs, they can do hand gestures, movement of eyes with great dramatic effect. And if the paper was not so long, I was going to give you another example of that. Maybe if you have questions, I might. So Sanjeev Gupta is a person of measured words. Yet I am impressed that stories are woven around objects by such men and women in a manner that illuminates the interpenetration of persons and things specific to the life worlds from which they emanate. In his reflections on the decline of aura, Benjamin stated that stories told around objects of use belong to their aura. He traced the decline of storytelling to the fact that commodities become obsolete so quickly that they do not have the time to collect stories around them. In Sanjeev and others, I found that public objects, a transformer here, a tube well there, a tile with the picture of a god placed on a rock at the corner of two roads, gathered stories around themselves that gave experiences of the place a lively quality. Ellie Friedlander comments on Benjamin's notion of aura to suggest that significance Benjamin associates with the work of art or with experience more generally is the sense that there is more to the object than meets the eye. The figure of an aura of light emanating from an object and surrounding it, making it slightly more than it is, suggests that there is a space of meaning that comes with the object and allows us to relate to it significantly. This is possible insofar as the object is embedded in tradition. The storytelling around objects that we saw in this case was not about being embedded in tradition, not about the memorials we carry around objects, not about the memories we carry around objects that come from our childhood, but rather about how objects are embedded in the future that Sanjeev imagines for his neighborhood and for his own place in it. I want to focus here on very specifically on three particular points very briefly. One, the open declaration in a public meeting by the official that the neighborhood in which Sanjeev lives is a colony of thieves, and the entanglement of expressions and actions that follow from that. Second, the confession by Sanjeev Gupta that there is indeed not much difference in the moral standing of those who threaten him and those who protect him. And see his remarkable performance of the voicing through which he brings the absent figure of the politician within his discourse through the mode of irony. It's tempting to analyze these episodes that make up the narrative tension in his account by using techniques of linguistic analysis such as shifts between personal pronouns, the I and the we, the use of the honorific ap, etc. But much would be lost if we were to remain at that level of analysis. I turn instead to issues I raised in the earlier sections on how the way that you get a stitching together of action and expression. Now consider the first episode when the official declares that they cannot supply electricity to a neighborhood of thieves. The utterance has an element of performance in it, and since the declaration is made by someone whose words carry the imprint of law of the state, we might say that though the utterance does not in itself make the residents into thieves, the statement is not hollow or void either. In fact, it is because the residents have already been treated as thieves who have been harassed by the police on complaints of theft of electricity that the statement is illocutionary false. So, in some ways, if we think about this as, instead of treating it as an indicative statement, we could attach the value to it precisely because of the game of challenge and counter-challenge. Put differently, we might say that in this there is an element of performance which in a typical Austinian sense would be around expression. But there's also a very interesting element of action which actually follows. So it's not simply a discursive contest that he offers. What he then offers is this entire line of action towards making a map and getting it authorized, and then trying to see in what does it mean to actually wipe out that particular stigma of being thieves. So if we then end up at a couple of other points that I'll skip, but I think what's very interesting here is that it's that we often tend to think of space and territory that is, we think of space as territory that is mappable and explorable, and place as that which relates to human occupation, dwelling, being lived in, etc. But this distinction is often mapped on another distinction between objective understanding of space and subjective understanding of it. While most scholars will now acknowledge that space cannot be seen purely as the container in which all things are put, I hope to have shown that the very conditions under which a neighborhood becomes mappable contains in itself a whole history through which law and the state are actually materialized. The objective and the subjective aspects are not two different points of view, but those which fold into each other, as such notions as authority, action, and expression are stitched together or torn apart. It will be recalled that a turning point in the story of wresting authority away from Ramjas Foundation was when Joshi and others from the locality were able to get access to the revenue registers and show that the khasra numbers of the plots that were created in the Waqf property were different from the area that they had carved out. And when this fact came to rest with the Supreme Court decision that Hindus could not create Waqf property that was not exclusively granted to Muslim charities. Similarly, in the story of electricity, it is the fight against the accusation that you're all thieves that gives the impetus to the map-making exercises that the neighborhood engages in. In both cases, the affect comes from being accused by some authority. And I have many very interesting stories around that, in which, however much you may then actually work that out, this initial sense that you stand accused gives a particular kind of affect to the manner in which relationships with the state are actually forged. So in both cases, the affect coming from being accused by some authority, a foundation, a private company, a state official, comes to mark the act of inhabitation of this particular space. Perhaps a generalized story here is that of powerful institutions outside the neighborhood embody the act of I accuse, and that it takes networks, resources, and a good deal of risk-taking ability for the scene of acquisition to be turned into a scene of inhabitation. But the poor turn out to be neither pure victims nor pure innocents. Their forms of politics will need to be acknowledged, as we do the conditions under which this form of politics comes to be engaged in. I think I'm being true to Srinivas's legacy and in not being able to come up with a punchy conclusion. But the description and the creation of those swirling affects that define what it is to work ethnographically will have to suffice for today, and I hope that these stories will have also pleased Srinivas if he was here to listen to them.
Thank you, Professor Das, for that. May I please invite Dr. David Shanklin, the President of the Royal Anthropological Institute, to give a vote of thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, my vote of thanks will be brief, but I would like to say what a great privilege it is for the Royal Anthropological Institute to be able to sponsor such an outstanding lecture. Many of you today here will know that the Royal Anthropological Institute has had a systematic interest in India for more than a century, but that interest ebbs and flows. But each time we return to the subject, of course, we have to relearn and think about new directions where this interest can take us. And today, truly, we have learned a very great deal. So, thank you very much indeed.
We're invited to a reception in the River Room on the second floor of this building.